This Parsha Podcast is dedicated in loving memory of Marvin Bentley. He was the brother of our friend Barb Pudlo, and he passed away today. May his soul be elevated in heaven. It's been an eventful week at Torch here at the Torch Center, at the new and improved Torch Center in Houston, Texas. We got the doors. The doors are delivered. Not quite installed, but that's a step in the right direction. And I'm very proud to announce that after months of lugging around a bursting inbox, I'm finally up to date. I've answered all the emails, and now I'm like a little rabbi ninja. Any email I get, it's whack-a-mole. I'm just responding fast right away. As soon as the email, I'm responding to keep that inbox at 0. So I got plenty of space. Hit me up, rabbiwolbe@gmail.com. All emails, please God, will be responded to promptly until maybe, just maybe something may happen, but that's the plan. That's the plan. rabbiwolbe@gmail.com. I want to tell y'all also that on one of my other shows, not the Parsha Podcast, one of the other shows, This Jewish Life, we recorded this week what I think is a fascinating podcast, an introduction to Midrash. We discuss Midrash very often here on the Parsha Podcast, so we have some familiarity with it. But if you want to know more about it, if you want a sweeping introduction to Midrash, where it comes from, how is it structured, what's the purpose of Midrash, how does it fit into the panoply of Torah literature, is everything in the Midrash true? Is everything literal in the Midrash? If you want to know more about Midrash, I recommend you giving it a listen. It's not to be found on the Parsha Podcast. It's on one of my other shows called This Jewish Life. I'm actually toying with launching a new podcast on Midrash. Let me know what you think. rabbiwolbe@gmail.com. This week's Parsha Podcast, I have something exotic to discuss. Of course, we're in the book of Genesis, and it's an embarrassment of riches. Every parsha is absolutely loaded with all sorts of amazingly interesting plot lines and narratives and personalities and stories and ideas. But of course, truthfully, we know that every word in Torah is laden with riches, is laden with unfathomable depth. But the stories and the drama of Genesis, it's much easier for us to connect with. And through the Parsha Podcast, we discover that hopefully every word of Torah is dripping with goodness and insight. We had a lot of fun, you may recall, in Leviticus. That's all true, but there's something special about Genesis. And what I discovered, we don't have to go very far into the Parsha to reach the point where I wanted to talk to y'all about something a little bit different, as you shall see. Of course, the Parsha focuses on Jacob. He's reeling from one crisis to the next. Esav wants to kill you because you stole his blessings. He seeks refuge with Laban, another villain. Come to Papa, I won't hurt you. He travels to Charan, and he has a very consequential pit stop on Mount Moriah. He has the dream with the ladder going to heaven with the ascending and descending angels, and he has a wonderful prophecy from God, and the stones fuse into one, and he anoints the stone. He heads to Charan. He has this event at the well. He sees the loafing shepherds at the well. He rolls off the stone, gives water to Laban's flocks, and he meets a new adversary. He meets Laban. And our sages tell us that Laban was worse than Pharaoh. His devilish plans were more nefarious than Pharaoh's. Pharaoh, who enslaved the Jews for decades, for centuries. Pharaoh, who slayed Jewish babies. Laban, the father-in-law of Jacob, was worse. Laban, the deceitful, wily, conniving scoundrel, he's worse, we're told, on some level, on some dimension, than Pharaoh. Jacob arrives and he meets Laban, And Laban runs up to him. Laban is his uncle. Laban is Rebekah's brother. And our sages point out that he's feeling him, trying to find where the gold is so he can pilfer it. He spends some time there, and he expresses his interest in marrying one of Laban's daughters. And he says, I'll work for you for 7 years, birachel bitcha haktana, in exchange for the rights to marry Rachel, your daughter, the younger one. Jacob knew who he's dealing with. He made the terms very clear. I want to marry Rachel, your daughter, the younger one. Sure, 7 years. You worked for me for 7 years, and Rachel is yours. And of course, Jacob works with fastidiousness and integrity for 7 years, and then comes the hot swap. Leah is in, Rachel is out. Laban pulls a fast one, does a switcheroo. Instead of giving Jacob his intended spouse, his intended bride, Rachel, he supplants her with her sister, Leah. Now, Jacob had suspected that Laban may try to pull a fast one, so he arranged some code words with Rachel. But Rachel, who was seeing that Leah was being led to the wedding canopy and was about to be publicly shamed, she gives over the signs, the code words, to her sister in an unprecedented act of selflessness. And Jacob wakes up in the morning. Turns out he married Leah. Laban, you swindled me. And Laban responds, well, listen, that's the policy over here. The older one must be wed before the younger one. But I'll give you Rachel as well. I'll give her to you, all right. Just 7 more years of hard work. And Jacob agrees, and he works for Laban for 14 years in exchange for the rights to marry his 2 daughters, 6 more years for pay. Over the course of those 6 years, Laban changes the terms of their agreement 100 times, so every 3 weeks or so. And notwithstanding all of Laban's trickery and chicanery, his wealth begins to make its way from Laban to Jacob. Of course, our Parsha details a lot more that happens. There's lots of familial drama. Jacob ends up with 4 wives, 11 sons in our Parsha, and a daughter, Dinah. Rachel was infertile, and Reuben found some jasmine, some herbs that were thought to promote fertility. They're given to Rachel. Jacob has a prophetic dream, instructing him to go back to Canaan. He gathers his family and his assets and absconds. Laban chases in hot pursuit. There's the standoff. Laban has told him prophecy, don't mess with Jacob. And after a tense exchange of words, they part amicably, and they build a monument beyond which neither side shall cross. In our Parsha, Jacob spends 20 years together with Laban, and he survives to tell the tale and heads back to Canaan to encounter his still mad brother, Esav, who still wants to kill him because of the theft and the heist of his blessings. That's the Parsha. And in this year's Parsha Podcast, we are going to do some ideas and a dilemma. Torah is your ID. And we have some exotic ideas today. Advanced, lofty, and exotic ideas that all center around the ladder. The ideas will be exotic. I think the dilemma will be quite practical and useful. So make sure you stick around for the dilemma, or if you're listening on the podcast and not joining us on the Parsha Podcast live on torchzoom.com, 8 p.m. on Central, just fast forward to the end. If you don't want any of the exotic stuff, you want just the practical stuff, go to the end. The Parsha starts off, Jacob is leaving his home in Canaan and traveling to Charan. He's leaving for a few reasons. Esav wants to kill him. He wants to marry one of the daughters of Laban. He heads out. And he stops. He stops in the place. He stops in Jerusalem. And he takes some stones and places them around his head because he's going to spend the night on Mount Moriah. He goes to sleep and he dreams. And in his dream, there is a ladder that is suspended between heaven and earth. It's firmly rooted in the ground, but the top of the ladder is in heaven. It's a pretty dramatic image. And on the ladder, there are angels, the angels of God, ascending and descending. And behold, God is there. He has a vision of God. And God tells him, I am the God of Abraham and of Isaac. The land upon which you are resting, I will give it to you and to your descendants. And your descendants will proliferate like the dust of the earth, and they will spread in every direction, and they will be a source of blessing for all of humanity. And I'll be with you, and I'll guard you in all the places that you go to, and everywhere that you turn. I'll bring you back here. I won't abandon you. It's a wonderful blessing. I want to focus on just one part, on just the ladder. When you open up the commentaries, there is so much literature on this ladder, on what it represents, on some of the symbolism and the secrets included in this, and that's what I want to ponder. So, of course, you look at the commentaries, you start with Rashi, and Rashi says, well, why are there angels going up and going down? Because Jacob was in Israel, but he's heading outside of Israel. He's going to the diaspora. And the angels that always accompanied Jacob, there were angels that were dedicated towards the land, and there are angels that are dedicated for outside the land, and there's a changing of the guards, and that's why some angels are leaving, the angels of the land of Israel, they're leaving, and the angels of outside the land of Israel, they are descending. They will accompany Jacob thenceforth. Okay, that's one idea. Put that aside. You open up the Ramban, you get a more advanced idea. The Ramban says that God was revealing to Jacob in his dream that everything that happens in this world, of course, it's all the handiwork of God. God not only created the world, but oversees it, perpetuates it, supervises it. But how does God supervise the world? It's done via angels. They implement the will of God in the world. So, who enacts the will of God? That is done by angels. And they're not independent. Don't make that mistake. They don't do anything, not small, not big, until they, so to speak, get their marching orders from God. But they enact, they implement, they execute on the divine policy in this world. And that's why there are angels going up and down. Why are angels going up and down? They're going up to get their instructions. They're going down to implement them. That's the system that the Almighty designed in the world. And that's what he's revealing to Jacob. And then God appears. And God speaks to Jacob directly, so to speak. And where are the angels? The angels, they don't make an appearance anymore. And that, the Ramban tells us, that's a revelation to Jacob that you are different. You are not going to be overseen by the angels. You are my portion, so to speak, the portion of God. And I will be with you always. You're going to have a more direct connection with the Almighty. There will be no intermediaries. There will be no filters. A righteous person will have some divine providence, divine oversight. But most of them, the Ramban tells us, the Almighty appoints angels to oversee them. And he cites a verse in Psalms, God will direct his angels to guard you in every path that you take. That's for the righteous. But the super duper uber righteous, the Jacob, God says, no, the angels go up and down. That's not for you. I'm going to be with you. I'm going to watch you. I'm going to protect you. I'm going to be with you at every step of the way. You are different. You are in a class of your own. You have direct divine oversight. Now, if we're told this about Jacob, it must have some relevance to us as well. The Ramban elsewhere, in his voluminous writings, he emphasizes that this status, this direct relationship, this heightened connection between God Almighty and humanity, this direct connection that's not intermediated by any angel, that is what separates the Jewish nation from all the other nations. What Jacob is being told over here, it's the fate of his descendants as well. And that is why the Ramban explains the blessings will be greater, the highs will be higher, and the lows may be more intense as well. There will be higher variance for Jacob and his descendants. Okay, this is a much more advanced idea, a theological idea of how the Almighty runs the world and the special relationship that he has with the righteous. And then he cites another idea from the Midrash. And this is an idea that I thought I would speak about at greater length. I just looked at the notes that I have today, and I'm like, I want to go a little slower. I want to be able to cover more. I don't want it to be so long. And it was so long. I cut out so much. This could have been a 2-hour podcast marathon. I wouldn't do that to you, would I? That's too long. That's like an audiobook. So I had to cut out a lot. But the Ramban also cites another midrash that, very interesting, that the angels going up and going down are the angels of the nations, specifically the 4 nations that will rule over Jacob's descendants. This is an idea we see all over Jewish philosophy. There are 4 exiles. The exile of Babylon, the exile of Persia and Media, the exile of Greece, and the exile of Edom. Jewish history is organized as periods of exile and redemption. Jews go to Egypt, they're in exile. They're redeemed. There's the Exodus. That's the Alpha exile. And then we have 4 subsequent exiles. They go to the land of Canaan, they settle it, they build a temple. Babylonians come and destroy the temple, sent into exile. The nation's plunged into exile. They come back, there's another exile, and so on. 4 exiles over the lifespan of, or the history, the retrospective, but really the ongoing story of the Jewish people. And the Midrash says, by the way, this Midrash is 1,500 years old. It's an old, ancient Midrash. The first angel that was drawn up the mountain was the angel who was the angel of the Babylonians. And he starts climbing up the ladder and climbs up 70 rungs. And then it goes down. And that's to symbolize that the Jewish people will be subjected to the Babylonians for 70 years. And then it's over. And then the next angel, the angel of Persia and Media, climbs up 52 rungs and ascends. The nation will be subjected to them for 52 years. And then the angel of Greece ascends 100 rungs, goes down. It's a 100-year exile. And then the 4th one, the angel of Edom, starts to climb and climb and climb. And he's in the stratosphere hanging out with the SpaceX rockets, and he's not coming down. And Jacob is beside himself. What's going to be? Will this ever end? And God says, don't worry about it. You're not going to see it going down. It's just going up. Eventually, it will come down too, even if it's all the way in the stars. The Ramban tells us, the Midrash tells us, if it's hanging out in the galaxies, in the constellations, with the celestial beings, that's how high it is. Don't worry, it too shall go down. This is another fascinating introduction. Like, this is Jacob about to head out of the land and into his own personal exile, and God's showing him that in exile, his personal exile and the exile of his descendants, God will be with them. Now, this is just Rashi and Ramban. I looked at many of the commentators, and it's just fascinating to see how in this one description, this one word of describing the ladder between heaven and earth and the angels are up and down, there's so much symbolism. So, for example, I saw the Baal HaTurim This is one of the great medieval sages who wrote a fascinating commentary on the Torah. And on this verse, the second verse of our Parsha, the third verse of our Parsha, I don't remember him offering so much commentary on a single verse. He connects it with everything. God's throne of glory is symbolized, God's chariot, the altar, the priests, the ramp of the altar, the exiles, the end of the exiles, idolatry of the nation, the power of prayer, the sign of revelation, sacrifices, the aroma of sacrifice heading up to heaven. There's a ton of symbolism and gematria that he finds in this verse. And I was thinking, as you're reading some of the commentaries, it gives you a tangible sense of the multi-dimensionality of the Torah. Of course, the Talmud tells us, we know this, that there's so many different facets of Torah, so many different dimensions and realms of Torah. There are 70 facets of Torah. There are 50 gates within Torah. There's almost infinite, or maybe there is infinite depth in Torah. And here we see one verse, one description of a dream, one description of this ladder connecting heaven and earth, and all the voluminous and very fascinating commentary that is featured. Now, I actually perused some of the Kabbalistic literature on this verse. The amount of literature on this, just the ladder and the angels go up and down, and what it symbolizes, it's, again, voluminous, vast, and very profound. And this is what I want to talk about. And I want to focus, I want to share two interesting exotic perspectives on the ladder. The first one will be exotic, and the second will be even more exotic. Let's approach it in this fashion. We know, we believe, we may even recognize that we have a soul within our body. Where is the soul situated? Where within us would you find the soul? Now, the sources tell us, the Midrash tells us, that a soul is comprised of 5 different parts. There's the nefesh, the ruach, the neshama, the chaya, and the yechida. And these are completely different levels of soul. It's almost as if they're 5 different souls that are chained together. But the truth is, like we could spend a lot of time talking about soulology, because within each segment of those 5, there are also 5 components. So if you look at the nefesh, in the nefesh, there is a nefesh of a nefesh, and a ruach of a nefesh, and a neshama of a nefesh, and a chai of a nefesh, and a yechida of a nefesh. And only then could you graduate, so to speak, to the ruach, and then there's the nefesh of the ruach, and so on. But the truth is, there's the nefesh of the nefesh of the nefesh, and the ruach of the nefesh, and so on. It's very much a fractal system. And the higher levels of the soul are so thoroughly lofty, they're way loftier than the loftiest of angels. So where exactly would you find the soul within the body of a person? So the sources are unanimous that even though the soul permeates the entirety of a person's body, that's not the entirety of the soul. In fact, most of the soul is outside a person's body. Only a minuscule part of the soul is captured within the body of a person. Now, just an analogy that I'm not making up. This is what the sages say. The relationship between a soul and a body is similar to the relationship of a body and a shoe. So the soul is inside the body, just like the body is inside the shoe, right? But how much of your body is inside your shoe? Well, if you wear boots, maybe it's a little more. You wear little flats, it's a little less, but it's not the majority of your body inside the shoe. It's, I don't know, 1%, 10%, depending on the size of your body, the size of your shoe. Only a small part of a person is inside the shoe. Only a small part of the soul is inside the body. Now, my daughter claims something just outrageous, that a single person could have multiple pairs of shoes. What an outrageous thing. Well, if one person can have multiple pairs of shoes, one soul can have multiple bodies. Just like, you could pull the soul, put your feet out of one pair of shoes and put them in another pair of shoes, put on some clogs, put on some Uggs, Birkenstocks. It's not a problem, right? The soul can exist in multiple bodies. So if you find any mitzvah in the Torah that relates to shoes, this is the symbolism or the secret behind it. Now, with that introduction, we find something absolutely fascinating in the Zohar, in his commentary to this verse. We have a ladder. Jacob visualizes a prophetic vision, a dream of a ladder. One part of the ladder is here, terra firma. The other part of the ladder is all the way up in heaven, as high in heaven as it goes. And the angels themselves need to ascend this ladder. This ladder, the Zohar tells us, is the soul. It's symbolic of the soul. The highest part of the ladder, the highest part of the soul, is rooted in heaven. And the lowest part, well, that's here. And this is a very powerful, very intriguing framework. A ladder is meant to be climbed, right? What's the purpose of a ladder? You want to get onto the roof to clear out the gutters. You want to ascend it. The soul is the ladder. And just as a ladder can be climbed, the ladder of the soul can and must be climbed. What part of the soul do we have within us? What part are we living with? Only the lowest rung of the soul ladder. And it goes all the way up to God himself, so to speak. And our job in life is to climb that ladder, meaning to ascend and unlock and expand the realms of soul that we are acquiring. Climbing up the ladder of the soul. Expanding, so to speak, the shoe. Moving up the stack to have more and more and more higher realms of the soul within us, to acquire that, to upgrade, to move up a stage in our relationship with the soul, to upgrade and upgrade and upgrade the levels of soul that are within us. Now, what this means is it's to transcend the state that we're in on day one. We talked about the soul having 5 parts. Only the lower 3, the nefesh, the ruach, and the neshama, only those 3 can have any connection with the body. If someone has moved up, so to speak, this ladder, and they've transcended the level of neshama, they're now the level of the chaya or the yechida, they're already a prophet, not a question. They've transcended their body. They're more like an angel than a person, maybe even greater than an angel. The Talmud tells us that Adam, before his sin, he was, this is the description, he was from the earth to the heaven. Now, when I read that the first time, I said, oh, he would be really good at basketball. He was so tall. He could dunk. No problem. It says he was from one end of the world to the other of the world, and from the floor, from the earth, all the way up to heaven. I think what this is teaching, it's not just a description of his size. It's a description of his spiritual size. He incorporated the entirety of his soul within him. He was so elevated that he acquired all that soul, even the highest of levels. You recall perhaps the Midrash that says that when Adam was created, the angels who saw him, they thought he was God. They mistook him for God, and they wanted to bow down before him to worship him. Why? Why would an angel think a human is God? Because he was not a human like we are, meaning he was a body that was housing a soul, but the level of soul that he had within him was so lofty, it was way, way, way higher and loftier than the angels. To them, they couldn't tell that this is anything but something that was so beyond them. They thought he was God. And he says, no, you got it wrong. The Almighty is God. I'm a creation. I'm not a creator. Scripture tells us, "V'techasreu me'at melokim." Humanity can be one notch below God. Now, of course, we're a creation. We're not a creator. But the soul, on its highest level, on the top of that rung, it's an inch away, so to speak, from God. And the Zohar tells us this is what's being shown here to Jacob. Now, when the Nefesh HaChaim, this is one of the classic books of Jewish philosophy, when he introduces this concept, he has a very sharp reading of the verse. The verse talks about the sulam, the ladder. It's mutzav arza, which means it's positioned on the earth. The word arza means to the earth, not on the earth. So the Nefesh HaChaim says, wait, it should say, if it's rooted on the ground, it should say that it's mutzav ba'aretz. It's on the ground. When it's arza, means it's to the ground. We think of the ladder. Where's the foot of the ladder? It's here, and it's going up to heaven. Actually, no, it's the opposite. The ladder is rooted there, and it's coming down to us. The soul is rooted in heaven. That's where the soul originates. It's rooted in heaven, and it concatenates its way downward to us. Where does the soul originate? Where's the top rung, so to speak, of the soul? Well, the verse tells us. God, so to speak, blew the soul of life into the nostrils of Adam. So the soul originates, where it starts from, up in heaven, so to speak, from the breath of God. That's the origin of the ladder, and it descends from there to the earth until us, simpletons, mortals, fragile and fallible humanity, our body, we take a small little foothold in the soul and hopefully begin to climb. This is what Jacob was shown. Now, if this was something that Jacob witnessed in his dream and we never knew about it, well, we wouldn't even know about this concept. It's featured in the Torah. And the Zohar tells us that at least one angle, one dimension, one facet of this verse is describing to us the nature of the soul, so to speak. We imagine that Jacob, all prophets, probably have all sorts of prophecies that we're not told about, we're not privy to. From the fact that this appears in the Torah, it means that it must be on some level pertinent to us small people, beginners and novices, simpletons, lay people. This very lofty idea, very exotic idea, is somehow relevant to us. So when I looked around some of the commentators, I saw some very interesting and powerful insights. There's some connection between heaven and earth. That's the soul. The loftiest parts of the soul are all the way up in heaven, in a place where there's no physicality. And the lowest part of the soul is here. We could have a touch point with our physical body. But they're connected with a ladder. What happens if you have a ladder that's going very, very high? You have to have someone there on the bottom to stabilize it, right? Got to hold the bottom of the ladder because any small movement can knock the ladder. And if you stabilize the bottom of the ladder, well, then there's stability throughout the entirety of it. But if you shake and wave the ladder, that movement is going to ripple throughout the entirety of the ladder. what does Jacob see on the ladder? He sees the angels of God going up and down. The angels of God are ascending and descending from heaven, here to heaven, on the ladder, on the soul of humanity. What are the angels doing? They're determining what's going to happen in the world. They're implementing the will of God in the world. They're executing his will. And what is the vehicle, the pipe that connects them, that brings them down? What's the avenue? What's the thoroughfare that determines their behavior, so to speak? It's the ladder. There's a very powerful idea here. Who and what will determine what happens in the world, both here below, angels coming down, and in heaven on high, angels going up? It's the ladder. It's our choices and our decisions and our righteousness or lack thereof. We believe that this grand creation of God, it has levers that are in our hands. We are the fulcra. I love that word. We're the fulcra that determines what happens in this entire grand system. So yeah, we may be at the bottom of the ladder, but our choices, our decisions, our values, our priorities ripples up the ladder. That's the messages that the angels, so to speak, convey to God on high. And when they come down and they bring down vitality and goodness and blessing to the world, the impact that we have, the state of the ladder, so to speak, that we are impacting, that will determine what kinds of messages they bring down with them. Now, this past Shabbos, I was walking to shul, and even though it was Parshas Toldos, last week's Parsha, I had to read on the podcast, right? You know that. I did the podcast. So I was already, in my head, I'm mulling Parshas Vayeitzei already last week. So I was chatting with my friend about the ladder. And he told me something interesting. He said, well, I remember my uncle told me, so this is my friend's uncle speaking here, which is another interesting lesson perhaps for us. When you climb a ladder, there's something very strange that happens. Our epicenter, well, you could say it's our heart or our brain. That's the human of the human, right? That's the headquarters of humanity. But that's not the thing that ascends the ladder first. Your hands go up first. Your actions, they ascend before you. There's a very special place for behavior, for actions in our philosophy. While, of course, the heart, the mind, the human of the human is the essence, is what is most important. But what brings about change in a person's behavior, in a person's outlook, in a person's heart, in a person's mind, in a person's values? What kickstarts it is a person's behavior. If you have a wicked person, they're wicked and their heart's wicked and their mind's wicked, they're wicked, but they do righteousness. Their actions are all righteous. The heart and the mind follow. The arms and the hands, the actions. And if someone's righteous and wholesome and good and pious in their heart, in their mind, but their actions are actions of wickedness, the heart and the mind follow. The hands follow the arms. Another very powerful idea from this ladder of the soul. My grandfather, blessed memory, used to say that if there's this continuum from the lowest level of the soul to the highest level of the soul, from the level that we start off at, and hopefully the levels that we could reach, we really can't max out. That's already not possible anymore. There are certain parts that are just not accessible with the current orientation of the world. But everyone finds themselves at some point along this continuum. And our sages tell us that there are 48 ways to acquire wisdom. And one of the ways is hamakir es mikomo, someone who knows their place. And my grandfather blessed memory used to say, it means to know your place on this ladder. Because every one of these millions of rungs, it has a special way for you to go up to the next level. And if I see someone who's 500 runs ahead of me, they're much loftier than me, and I look at what they're doing, and I say, you know what, I'll just mimic them. They're so righteous and pious and elevated, I'll just copy them. That's a big mistake, because they're at a different place. And therefore what they need to do must be tailored to where they're holding in this ascent. You have to know your place, because your place determines what is the next course of action for you to take. There can be an identical act that for one person is a great mitzvah, and for the other person it's a great sin. It's a grievous, unconscionable sin. Why? Because for one person, that's the next step up for them. And for the other person, that may be 15 or 1,500 or 15 million runs below where they're holding. And therefore, every person is an individual. You have to know your place and know what's the next step for you. We're on a ladder. We're heading up, hopefully, goes all the way to God. This is the most lofty and elevated and transcendental of journeys. Even when we are on the bottom rungs, we know, we understand, we appreciate that we're still connected and we're still bound to the higher and loftier realms, even though they may be distant and apparently inaccessible from our current position. And finally, my grandfather, blessed memory, he used to say, growth is change. But change does not mean that you have to change. It could be essential to who you are. It's inherent to who you are. Change is not something that you acquire externally. You're on this ladder. Necessarily you're on the ladder. And yes, it's possible, by the way, that the ladder goes below the earth. There are 49 realms of impurity, our sages tell us. And once you fall off that, God forbid if someone were to hit the 50th level, that's the point of no return. But everyone is on this ladder. And just as you're on a ladder, you can ascend it. And that is the growth that happens from within. The greatness is achievable. Just move up to the next rung. Fascinating idea. Very exotic idea. It could be part of, the imagery of the Parsha that we just read through very quickly. You open up the commentaries, you see the Zohar, you see these very fascinating, very profound, deep ideas, a structure, a framework of our life and our journey. But now I want to have even the even more exotic idea. Maybe a bit radical. And I'll start with a citation, a very famous citation from the Talmud. The Talmud cites a verse in Devarim, chapter 23, verse 10. Vinishmarta mikol davar ra. And you shall guard and protect yourself from any bad thing. What does this mean? So Talmud says, well, any bad thing. You have to guard yourself from any bad thing. So the Talmud interprets this as saying, you should not even think, have a fleeting thought during the day that can cause you to have any impurity during the night. What does it mean to protect yourself, to guard yourself from any bit of evil? Mikol davar, from all remnants and scintilla of bad. Don't even think something by day or have a fleeting thought by day, something that could bring about impurity at night. That's the Talmud. And the Talmud says that one of the sages deduced a lesson from this lesson. So we have a verse, we have the interpretation of the verse, and then we have the ladder of Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair. If that name doesn't sound familiar, one of the great sages of the Mishnaic era, Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair. And this is what he deduced from that teaching. Listen to this. Torah study, brings a person towards vigilance. Vigilance brings a person towards alacrity. Alacrity brings a person towards cleanliness. Cleanliness brings a person towards abstinence. Abstinence brings to purity. Purity brings to piety. Piety brings to humility. Humility brings to fear of sin. Fear of sin brings to holiness. Holiness brings to a holy spirit of prophecy. And that brings about revivification of the dead. So we have a verse. You should guard yourself, protect yourself from all bad things. We have the explanation of that verse. Even a bad thing, like a fleeting thought that can lead to impurity at night, you should guard yourself from that. Comes along where Pinchas ben Yair and says, okay, there's a whole ladder. Starts off with Torah, brings to vigilance, to alacrity, to cleanliness, to abstinence, to purity, piety, humility, fear of sin, holiness, prophecy, reviving the dead. Now, if this sounds familiar, this citation is the source material for the book titled Mesilas Yesharim, The Way of the Upright, or The Path of the Just, which is the most famous and authoritative book on Musar and character development. The book takes each one of these steps, Torah brings to this, brings to that, brings to that, and has multiple chapters on each one of these characteristics, what it is, how to get it, how to avoid its detractors. And if you read this, there's a pattern here, right? You start off with Torah, and that brings you to the next stage, which is vigilance, which brings you to this, which brings you to that, until the end of that journey is you have the ability to revive the dead. So if you want to know how to revive the dead, I have a guaranteed and foolproof way to do it. There's the instructions of a book that are guaranteed to bring you there. Read it, and you'll see why it's easier said than done. My grandfather, of blessed memory, whenever he would teach about this dream of Jacob, where there is a ladder that starts off on the ground, or part of it, that the one end of it is here on the ground, and the other end of it is all the way up in heaven, by God, so to speak. He would cite the idea of ladders of ascent. And the classic example is what Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair did here in this teaching in the Talmud. There's a ladder. You want to get to the top? You have to start in this rung, go to the next, go to the next, go to the next. All rungs really are the same, right? You think of a physical ladder, the rungs are the same. It's just a horizontal bar that you climb up and to the next horizontal bar. But here's a different type of ladder. It starts off with one thing that you should acquire, Torah, and that will bring you to the next different thing, which is vigilance, which is alacrity and so on, cleanliness, purity and so on, all the way to the top, reviving the dead. And my grandfather, he had an encyclopedic knowledge of a very specialized area of scholarship and of personal growth and development. The many different examples of this phenomenon where the sages would devise a ladder of spiritual ascent. many different sages devised their own ladder. So, of course, the canonical example is the one we just mentioned in the Talmud. But the Rambam, he has a whole system. You start off with this, and you go to that, and you go to that, until you arrive at the peak, so to speak. And he has, in a few of his books, he talks about this idea. The Rambam has his, the Ramban Nachmani has his. Chovos Halvavos, duties of the heart, is entirely structured as a ladder. Rabbeinu Yonah has several of these, several different ladders that he presents to his readers. The Kuzari has a different ladder, and so on. And then my grandfather, of blessed memory, writes in one of his own books, this book that you are holding in your hand, it's also a ladder. It's a ladder that I devised for you. It's a different ladder. And it starts off with a life of Torah. And that brings you towards self-development and working to develop yourself and to upgrade yourself. And from that, it takes you and makes you someone who is a ma'ayan, who is a wellspring of wisdom and renewal. And from that to the highest level of the book, a life of holiness. Now, just this idea is fascinating that really every sage, or at least the sages that are mentioned over here, based upon their own different unique path, they each developed their own way to ascend this ladder to God. But then the question can be posed, which ladder should we choose? Suppose a person is doing all the Torah, following all the laws of the Torah, but you want more. You want to ascend the ladder. You don't want to just be in conformity with the laws of the Torah. You want to become close to achieve proximity with God, so to speak. And you see, the sages, each one has their own different ladder. Which one should you opt for? That's a powerful question. And in one of his books, his most famous book that he wrote, my grandfather, of blessed memory, writes, really? You should make up your own ladder. You should devise a ladder of your own. Now, when I read that, well, this is impractical, I thought. How do you do that? What can I do? How advanced must I be? That's why it's an exotic idea. How would a person go about finding levels of spiritual growth that follow a certain continuum? This is level 1, level 2, level 3, level 4, and so on, until you arrive at the highest level to proximity to God. We see one of the sages in the Talmud did it. It gives a whole list of themes. This follows that, follows that, follows that. Now you can revive the dead. But how would someone like me do that? Now, my grandfather writes about this idea. He loved this idea. And he writes about it in many places. And in one of the places says, hey, if you want to work on yourself, you should make your own ladder. It doesn't say how to do it. And he starts to list a whole litany of different sages and the ladders that they devised. But I found in some of my grandfather's other writings, he offers 2 different ways to construct your own ladder. And I'll tell it to you very briefly. It's a long piece. It's a very long essay that I'm just fascinated with this. When I'm doing the podcast, I have to what are the ideas that really speak to me and what will be interesting to the audience? And I'm always not sure. Is this something which really excites me, but maybe doesn't excite you as much? To me, this is absolutely fascinating. This whole notion that there's a specific way, a tailored way that you could find a ladder of one quality leading to another, that you can make up on your own. To me, that's just a fascinating idea. And he has an essay that I found, not one of the published books, in the manuscripts. It's a very long piece. I'm just going to give you just the short version of it. The cliff notes of this concept. He says, everyone's different. We all have a different soul. And therefore, everyone's predispositions, everyone's strengths and weaknesses are going to be a bit different from everyone else. And you have to find the strengths, the qualities, the characteristics, the traits that are within you in a very dominant way. And that's going to be the root, so to speak, of your ladder. Now, he doesn't really flesh it out exactly how to do it. But the concept that I'm gathering from what he is saying is that you start from within. What gifts did the Almighty give you? What strengths? What abilities? What characteristics? What very unique skills and gifts that you were given? And channeling that's the starting point. And maybe we can't just pontificate or speculate, sit on an armchair and say, well, if this leads to that, and so on, then this will be the end. No, you have to do the journey yourself. So you start with what you have and you work on developing those skills and actualizing those skills. And that will naturally bring you to another stage. And then you stop and assess and say, wait, where'd that come from? Where'd this new rung of greatness come from? And then you piece together, oh, this led to that. And if you're mindful over the course of your lifetime, and you're serious about personal growth in this very advanced, I called it exotic fashion, you can actually see how your life, how based upon your own characteristics, your life resulted in this ladder that you've ascended. You look back and say, well, that's where I started. And somehow through this continuum, this led to that, this led to that. You've now devised your own ladder that you can demonstrate for others. This is another path of ascension. Again, very advanced ideas. But then he suggests another way. The verse tells us you should guard yourself from any bad thing. Any bad thing. What does that mean? Any bad thing. Even a fleeting thought by day that can lead to impurity at night. Even that you have to guard yourself and protect yourself from. Now, we don't always control our thoughts. Sometimes thoughts stay there like intruders. We don't have the ability to protect ourselves. How are we supposed to protect ourselves against these types of intrusive thoughts? To have like a subtle, fleeting thought, sometimes you sit down, I'm going to concentrate on this. I'm going to focus on this. Okay, that's an activated thought. But just a fluttering thought that pops into someone's head, and I have to protect myself from that? That was his question. He started with the result. The Torah tells you this is what I want you to do. So this result must be achievable. So he starts where everyone starts. Start with Torah. And after studying Torah, he realizes, well, I'm more vigilant now. And vigilance, well, that should help against intrusive thoughts, but it's not quite enough. So he persisted, and he persisted, and he persisted until he arrived at something called holiness. And holiness is a transformation of a person's essence from being physical to being spiritual. And once a person achieves holiness, their thoughts do not meander to places, to intrusive thoughts that can lead to impurity at night. They no longer arrive. And thus, he started with the endpoint. The Torah is demanding this endpoint. It seems unachievable, and it is unachievable when you start off the journey. But it must be achievable. Let's find a way to achieve that. And he started, and he persisted until he arrived at the end, and indeed fulfilled the requirement of the Torah. You shall guard yourself from all bad things. So maybe this too is a way when you read something in the Torah, love God. I don't ever understand God. I have a hard time defining God. We don't even engage in theology. We don't say the name of God that's most connected to his essence because it's so unfathomable to us. We're supposed to love God? The Torah says love God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your resources. Well, that's the end point. How do you get there? You have to find a pathway. You have to find a ladder. And by the way, that is the Rambam's ladder. I didn't tell you what the ladder was. But the Rambam's ladder is like we start off with the end point. You have to love God. Emotions for God? I can't visualize God. I have no physical or sensory relationship with God. I have to love him with this emotional love, my whole heart and my whole soul, all my resources, everything. There's a way to do that. The Rambam devised the ladder. And so on. You start from the end and you figure out what will it take to arrive there. And that too, perhaps, can be a second way to craft a ladder of your own. I will tell you, this question really intrigued me, and I speculated another approach for how to construct your own ladder, but we'll leave that maybe for another time. But this whole idea, different types of ladders, and everyone should construct their own. To me, that's a very powerful, interesting, intriguing, and exotic idea. But let's get to this week's dilemma. Imagine you're a prophet. It's hard to fathom, of course, but humor me. You're a prophet, and God appears to you and gives you a direct order. What do? There's no ambiguity. It's a clear instruction from God. What do you do? So we would think that you obey immediately. Jacob in our Parsha behaves otherwise. In chapter 31, verse 3, God said to Jacob, where's the ambiguity here? Return to the land of your forefathers and to your place of birth, and I will be with you. Jacob is with Laban in Charan. He has a whole bustling household, 4 wives, many, many children. God says, go back home. And the way Jacob behaves, it's astonishing. He has a summit with his 2 wives in the field, and he starts to tell him about his strained work environment. I see your father Laban, his disposition towards me, it's not quite the way it was in the past. And I worked for your father with great trustworthiness. I worked for your father with all my strength, but he treated me very poorly. And he changed my wages 100 times, but God did not allow him to harm me. He gives a whole history of his work relationship with Laban. And he says, if Laban says, you'll have all the speckled sheep that are born, well, then all the sheep were born speckled. And if it's the streaked flock, well, then all of them were born streaked. He's given this whole history, this whole backstory of his work relationship with Laban and how God protected him from the deceptiveness of his father-in-law. And he says, oh, by the way, God commanded me to go back to Canaan. This is what's called burying the lead. When you want to tell a story, you present the central point first, and then you add all the tangential ancillary points afterwards. Why is Jacob launching an impassioned soliloquy that it seems to have no bearings on what he wants? God tells you to leave. That's it. Nothing else matters. Why does he outline the poor work environment and Laban's treachery? And then he says, oh, by the way, God gave us a direct order. It's kind of strange. Now, the response of Rachel and Leah is equally puzzling. They too begin to present their complaints with Laban. Do we still have a share in the inheritance of our fathers? He treats us like foreigners, and all the wealth that God has taken from him, it's justifiably ours and our children's. We don't care for Laban either. He treats us like foreigners. And then they conclude, oh, and whatever God says to do, we'll do. It's an amazing thing. The Torah spends a lot of time telling us about this conversation back and forth, this summit in the field, and everyone seems to be ignoring, or at least relegating to tertiary, the central point. God said, go. You go. No questions asked. Why does the relationship with Laban, why does that all matter? Why is that so central and so primary in this discussion? So the great Musar master, the Alter of Kelm, says something very powerful. Jacob had a dilemma. He's married to 4 locals. They've never been to Canaan. He has a family that's known no other place besides for this place. He's the only one who came from Canaan. His 4 wives, his 12 children are all local to Charan. That's the only place that they know. They've been there for 20 years. It's not like they're newcomers, okay? They've been there for a while. And he has to persuade them. We have to go back home. 12 kids, 4 wives. We're traveling 1,000 miles to a place we've never been to a foreign country. There are 2 ways to go about this. You could say, listen, God says to go. Or you could say God says to go, but you first make it more appealing and more palatable. Jacob understood that he is presenting a very difficult test for his family. They're being told, we have to leave our environment, our secure environment where we've lived our entire lives, and we're going to parts unknown. And by the way, we heard about this Esav guy who wants to kill you, right? We know that it's not like it's some sort of safe, secure place. They have to forfeit everything, all of their comfort, to go and listen to God, to go back to Canaan. This is a test. And what Jacob is doing is showing us a master class for what to do when you have a difficult test. When you have a difficult test, the first thing you try to do is shrink the test. Make it smaller. Make it easier. Don't try to say, I'm gonna man up. I'm gonna muster my fortitude, my strength, my willpower to overcome this challenge. That's not the way to do it. The way to do it, tactic that Jacob devises for us to be a bit more clever. When you are facing an uphill battle, you have to do it. You have to overcome it. It's not so great here. Come on. Laban, he's mistreating me. I work really hard. And he's trying to steal. He's a swindler. Oh, by the way, we have to go anyhow because God said to do so. And they do the same tactic. Are we going to inherit Laban? He treats us like foreigners. It's not so exciting to stay here. Instead of trying to marshal the intestinal fortitude to overcome, they made it much easier. And to me, this is a very powerful tactic that we can employ in our life as well. Any growth that we have, any, call it ascent of the ladder that we have, it's going to be difficult. The Yetzer Hara is pushing against us. We are facing stiff headwinds. And if we're not clever and we just try to brute force it every time, maybe sometimes we'll succeed. But that's not the smart way to go about it. We could be a bit more shrewd and calculating and clever, the way Jacob was. This is a challenge. This is a difficulty. Let's make it as easy as possible. Let's lower the bar so it's easier to clear. Don't just try to fight it. Be clever. Be cunning in your battles. That is the way to win. That's a tactic that Jacob used in his dilemma that we can use in our tests, in our challenges, in our ascent up the ladder. I appreciate your attention. I appreciate you joining me on this journey. I understand it was a bit more exotic than usual, This is something which I'm not done with this topic. The first idea of the soul being this ladder and the implications thereof. That to me is a fascinating idea, but the idea that really captures my imagination is the idea that really everyone should construct for themselves a ladder to heaven. And there's many, many examples that my grandfather collected and wrote about in his books of the sages and how they constructed their own ladder. And we have two ways to do it, or at least two concepts of how to go about doing it. And we have something very practical and very useful. We're going to face all sorts of tests in our growth, in our ascent. There is no need to be a hero. There's no need to try to clear the highest pole. You could lower it, make it easier. That's what Jacob did, and that's what we ought to do as well. Thank you for listening to this edition of the Parsha Podcast. Parsha Podcast live on Torch Zoom, 8 p.m. Central on Tuesday evenings. We're about halfway through Genesis. I'm enjoying it so far. I know it's going overtime, a lot longer than it used to go. I'm going to tinker with it. I'm going to experiment. I'm going to try to improve, make it a little shorter. I know sometimes you see it's like an hour and a half. Oh my. My advice is put it on 1.5 speed. I met someone this morning, an old friend of mine from Houston. He's a big fan of the podcast, he lives in Israel now. And I saw him. He's coming to visit. He was here for Thanksgiving. So I said, hey, what's going on? Scotty, good to see you. And it's like, oh, you're speaking so slowly, because I always listen to you at 1.5 speed. So I say 1.7, 1.9. If you're brave, go into the 2s. And when I listen to myself, I go into the 3s. And I use an app that also eliminates all the silence. If there's like a point that you want to add some drama and you pause and you relish the pause, you can eliminate all that. Take this hour and 15 minutes now, shrink it down to 35 minutes, but you might have to listen to it twice if it's too fast. But anyhow, that's my advice. I'm still trying to figure out how to do this properly. We're meeting live now on torchzoom.com. If you listen to the podcast, you don't have that same experience. That's okay. Send me an email, rabbi@wolbachim.com. My inbox is empty. It's empty. And it's being refreshed every minute to see if anyone's going to write to me. rabbi@wolbachim.com. Have a wonderful day. Have a sensational rest of your week. And please God, a successful and productive and meaningful and uplifting Shabbos upcoming. And please God, with the help of the Almighty, we will talk again next week.